Welcome, Nolan Lem. We really appreciate you joining us and finding the time in your busy schedule. So, Nolan is a 2019 FETA Prize in Sound Art winner with his piece Tentacule.
Yeah, I mean, it's at this point, it's so broad. Um, and, historically, it's always maintained a pretty close relationship with technology. And I guess that's why you were saying a lot of the people that are involved tend to be, well, technologists in some form or researchers. And um, probably most likely because in the 20th century, when a lot of the kind of sound reproduction technologies were developing, people, it did require a certain amount of not only technical skill, but also like resources to access those things. And maybe less so now than in the past. But so yeah, it's always kind of had this relationship with technology, and people in sound studies write a lot about that, and specifically with sound. But I guess for a while that probably made it less inclusive. Now I think because it's expanded the genre so much, it really, I find it to be a pretty like open community, and with people doing really all kinds of stuff from, really kind of hardcore research in technology programming, software design, things like that. But then also, performance practices that really kind of are maybe more of like performance art related categories. I got into it personally through jazz, like you said. I still am a big jazz nerd, and I was a saxophone major a long time ago, and yeah, at some point I started getting more interested in composition and contemporary music, and then for me and for a lot of people, it's kind of a slippery slope into I guess electronic music in some form. And then for me in particular, I got more into doing sound art on kind of, in like an art context, more of like a gallery context. Um, so yeah, it was kind of a natural progression for me. But I don't know if I do think of sometimes if about how jazz plays into what I'm doing now, because I still do really value the idea of improvisation. Um, and I do think some of my work now, I mean, a lot of my work does have this kind of indeterminacy associated with it. That's kind of like jazz. It's just like setting things up so that kind of interesting things might happen. And that's kind of what jazz musicians do too, in a way. So I kind of still feel like there's a connection there. So yeah, because I was doing more like kind of solo electronic electroacoustic saxophone stuff, and then I don't even know how really exactly, but I guess I started getting into doing analog circuit design. And so then I had actually gone to do the electrical engineering degree. And so I guess just having that physical, I don't know, the kind of physical interaction with electronic materials was really rewarding and fulfilling. And that drove me to kind of this really physically based kind of physical work, mechanical kinetic work. And I mean, inevitably something always goes wrong. And I always say, like, if one of my pieces doesn't like catch on fire and there's no dead children, then it's like a success. So like, yeah, there's always especially with kinetic work, there's always just like you kind of have one life. It's like a video game where you don't have multiple lives, because if it breaks, it kind of breaks. And so that's kind of nerve wracking. But yeah, like it's always a compromise, at least for me. And there's always materials or a budget that a motor that I can't have, or something that I wish I could use and I can't. And so it always ends up being a compromise, because, like everybody wants to do the perfect thing that they envision. And I've been really fortunate to have a lot of resources available for a lot of my pieces. So I feel really fortunate. But yeah, I mean, the way I envision it, initially to the end product is always quite different. And again, there's a lot of improvisation involved with that, especially with materials and things just kind of don't work. And you go to Europe and then you're like, oh wow, the voltages are different, and or just like little things are always just are there, and they're always challenges. So it's more accepted now, I think, in like the contemporary art world than it probably used to be. But I find the main challenges are the resources involved. So like, I think sound art tends to require a lot of space. It requires kind of isolation, spatially, acoustically, and also, it doesn't have the same kind of like, I don't know, like like kind of status power as a lot of other forms of contemporary art. So I find it to be it's still a little bit kind of pigeonholed. But I think that's changing slowly. And again, sound art also is, personally, I think it still kind of revolves around a lot of institutions, like, well, academia, for instance, or there's the people that get these big shows at like major galleries, but they come from kind of like a popular music, maybe experimental popular music background, someone like Bjork or like Animal Collective, and they have a big name, they kind of have this status recognition, and then they can access those bigger institutions. But for a lot of people on kind of emerging artist scale, it's still kind of treated as a separate entity, or that's my perspective, at least. So, but it's really fulfilling to carry out in the end too. And so I think that's what, it's really stressful, but then in the end, it always feels like it's worth it. But then I'm usually so stressed at the time, I'm like, this is the last time I do a thing where I'm like reproducing like 100 like mechanical pieces over and over again. So
It's nice to hear how the process goes. And I'm sure it's very complex and challenging, but we're also very, very grateful to you for being persistent, because we enjoy your pieces and now we're gonna talk about them.
I was telling Nevena that I hadn't, I don't have this on my website, and she found this on YouTube and I forgot about it. It was 10 years ago. And I was just saying how old I feel, because that was when I even had a ponytail. Yeah, this was electroacoustic piece, and you can't see there's 4 channels, but this was actually quasi-notated piece, and this was when I was more into composition. And I was really trying to, not master, but just learn how to do circular breathing, which is when you don't breathe at all when you play saxophone. Or you kind of do this thing so you can not have to stop and take breaths. So, what else can I say? I was really into this kind of style of jazz for a while. That it's kind of like Peter Brutzmann and these kind of weird Dutch guys, and so this was certainly influenced by that. And the notation was actually just a lot of these weird fingerings, and they were just these kind of cells and loops that would just kind of remind me of ways that I, as an improviser, could kind of get weird sounds out and I don't know, create this kind of somewhat minimalist kind of procedural piece. This piece was like the third of my like Velcro pieces. So there was a time when I was like really into, well, I guess I still am, but I was really into Velcro. So I was making these pieces using the sound of Velcro being ripped. And so this was kind of like the third iteration of like the Velcro themed piece. But I don't know, I guess I was just always fascinated by the sound. And this was in, my first Velcro piece was in 2015, which also coincided with kind of like ASMR entering the zeitgeist. Like people really kind of knowing what ASMR is. And Velcro is a sound trigger. And so I was really fascinated by this kind of idea of a community of people aroused in some way by sound as a sound fetish. And I was also into this idea of Velcro creating like a perpetual ripping sound that never stopped. So my first Velcro piece was a piece called Bands With. I don't know if you saw that, but it was just these Velcro machines that kind of a similar mechanism, but they just ripped Velcro kind of on these long panels. And yeah, it was like these walls of noise. And so I was just interested in, there's this spectrum of kind of, when you have a lot of these kind of pulse-like, I don't know, pulse-like extrications happening, there's kind of like, you hear a single extrication on one side, and then on the other side, you have like almost like broadband white noise. And so I was interested in playing with that kind of spectrum, and you get this incredible, it's really hard to hear in the recording, but you get this incredible spatialization that happens when you approach it as like a physical object. And so I always kind of say it's like, people are really into these multi-channel pieces, but when you're using Velcro, it's almost like, you're using like, tens of thousands of channels, because you have individual Velcro extrications happening. And because of that sound, that specific type of kind of like pulse sound, you actually can, you localize that type of sound in a really specific way. And so it kind of creates this unusual auditory image. So yeah, those are just kind of some of the things that I was thinking about with all three of the Velcro pieces. Although the autonomous sense object was really specifically about kind of eroticism and ASMR community, and it really is kind of playing off of the visual imagery, at least in that community. So yeah, I have this like an actual object that's laced in actually like bondage material, and also with Velcro. Then I have these like 3D printed fingers, actually my finger, on these kind of pans that rotate and then rip Velcro. And then this was actually the main way how it makes sound, which is I put Velcro on speaker cones. And then as the Velcro gets ripped, it actually uses just the mechanical, it uses the speaker cone as just like a mechanical amplifier. So there's no electrical signal in the speaker, but the cone itself is just kind of being ripped and amplifying the Velcro sound. So you have that sound, and then you have the fingers getting stuck to the rotating object. And then you have this kind of like, this is actually, people have a hard time knowing the scale. It's actually pretty small. It's almost like a fish tank size piece, and there's like neon pink light. So it kind of has this like sex shop toy vibe, and mirrored background. So I was kind of going for this display case, kind of like you're in like a, I don't know, it's just a lot of different imagery related to erotica, I suppose.
I'm also curious how you stepped out of the audiovisual sphere into the tactile and ASMR, just the idea of having the sensation that's physical through the sound. So was that the initial thing when you were just considering using Velcro, or was it just the consequence? And also, do you see that that's like another dimension of your installations, which is emotional, right? Or does it add to the idea of synesthesia of art, of your art?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's no denying that the visual element, um, changes the way we perceive the sound itself, and vice versa. And so that's always it's always a consideration. And I mean, my work at this point is, completely related to the movement and the visual element. Even though I think for a lot of my pieces, the initial impetus for them is kind of a curiosity about how something would sound. But invariably, when you have a lot of moving objects, and then you see a sound source, and you're trying to kind of recreate how the sound is being produced, all those different sensory modalities come into play and affect each other. And that's, I think that's where a lot of the complexity lies, and that's what's interesting to me in a lot of physical, material, kinetic-based sound pieces. But yeah, I mean, even in the last piece, like the autonomous piece, it was, if you just heard it, you wouldn't necessarily pick up on the creepy fingers getting, the creepy fingers in the vitrine erotica shop. So yeah, it plays a big role, of course. Yeah.
Excellent. We had a question related to Tentacule. So are there contact mics within the drum in Tentacule?
Oh, no, there's no contact mics. Yeah, it's all this sounds being mechanically produced. So
also, Mark was asking about whether you do your own fabrication.
Yes, I do. I do my own fabrication. I don't have any interns yet, so I'm just kidding.
Now is the chance if someone wants to
Now is the chance, yes. Yeah.
raise their hand and ask anything about these two works or the saxophone piece. Huh? Jason? Charlie.
Good to see you, and nice to
Good to see you.
About your work. I was curious about actually related to those pieces, the speaker just as a amplifier for the resonator tube, or I'm not sure in autonomous sense objects what they're connected to. Why specifically the like object of a speaker and not just a membrane, some other membrane that could transmit that vibration as well? Is there something specific about the object and its particular resonance for that piece for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess there was a time, it was really before that, but there was a time when there was like a lot of people doing work with just like a bunch of different speakers and like kind of big arrays. Like I'm thinking of like, like the microtonal wall, like Tristan Paris work, and some of like Georg Vogel's pieces and stuff like that. And I just thought it was interesting when you have a bunch of speakers. It kind of implies that there's some algorithm or technology being employed, and there's some spatial element, and I thought it's kind of like confounding element when you have a speaker that doesn't have any electrical signal. So it was, I guess in a way, it was a way to kind of reference historical work based off of, using the speaker as this kind of sound art object. But it was also just practical because it was like a object that was, pre-made, prefab, and art is cheap, and works pretty well for doing that type of sound. So.
And then I also wanted to ask if you experience ASMR yourself.
Yeah, I do, but I only get it in person. So like the videos online don't really do it for me. So it kind of sucks. So yeah, I do. I get it a lot with like gesture. Like I love watching people pour tea, like these really elaborate tea ceremonies. I'm like really into that. But I'm not like a hardcore ASMR person or anything. So I don't have a YouTube channel.
Interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? Or we move on to the new set of pieces that are connected in terms of mechanisms. We have rocks in row, hive mind, and dice roll.
Yeah, because it's kind of like quasi-determinate, but not completely subject to chance. But yeah, these pieces and the one I guess after hive mind, they both are similar because they involve these reciprocating platforms. And they actually initially grew out of like some of my research in these systems of coupled oscillators. Yeah, so the rocks and roll piece actually came second. And and each, I guess I was thinking of these, I like to think of certain objects as having kind of like an internal rhythm that's maybe unrealized sometimes. And so these rocks actually have like, rolling frequencies. They kind of have like resonant frequencies associated with them. And so I was like, okay, well, how can I kind of exploit that? And so I built, they're actually really large rocks, and those platforms were really heavy. And that's why I had to use treadmill motors to push them, because I could actually like put myself, it would push me on those big surfaces. But yeah, I mean, the speed would change over time, and I kind of had to program it so that they would kind of approach the same frequencies as some of the rocks. And then certain rocks would kind of get stuck, and you'd think they're like, okay, that rock will never come out, but then like it would just get hit by another rock and come out. So it created this, so as far as it being determinate or not, like it was kind of, it's kind of in between, because I knew that it was pushing at a frequency that would change and an amplitude that would kind of give the rocks the best likelihood of having a lot of unusual motion. So I kind of, yeah, it's not exactly random, but it's kind of, partially, I could control it as much as I felt like I could. So there's not really any frequencies associated with like the individual dice in this piece in the same way that like the rocks are, but they are all independently being activated, or being kind of like rolled, so to speak. It's kind of hard to see, but there's actually, I think, 4 rolling machines. But I couldn't control the dice individually. So the machines, each machine can have its own pattern. But it was a way to really activate a bunch of, I think I had about like 300 dice or something like that. And I have this subtitle. Well, but yeah, this piece, it doesn't have, there's no reciprocating platform, and this was in 2015, no, 2014 maybe, 2015. And this is a piece I did during my MFA, and yeah, I like the idea of the sound object of rolling the dice, the sound associated with when you roll a dice, what that means, how that relates to the kind of history of probability, and probability being used in like, music composition, and also just, as like a kind of symbol and sonic signifier of noise in a way. So it's kind of a convenient and culturally specific way to create noise, or to create kind of patterns of noise in different ways. And so, yeah, sometimes they do these kind of pulses, and sometimes they roll them really hard and really fast, and sometimes they do these kind of slow, these kind of slow, I don't know, like dances or something. Yeah, so kind of those pieces, like my last piece I did in Praise of Idleness, and then in Menagerie, both of those use this idea of the swarm and kind of the collective dynamics, the collective behaviors of actually systems of coupled oscillators, kind of in a swarm format. So it's just it's what a lot of my PhD research is about. Yeah, this piece was in September in Ljubljana. Amazingly, during COVID, it went on somehow. And yeah, so it uses it's these different synchronization mechanisms from this swarm, kind of create different polyrhythms, or to synchronize them completely. And again, kind of explore this territory from independent elements that are sounding to create a broader texture, to kind of individual rhythms that converge onto each other. So I used in this piece the sound of a racket tool, which initially was interesting to me because it's a symbol of work, but it's also kind of a symbol, the sound itself, and the motion is kind of like a clock. It's like a tick-tocking of a clock or a metronome or something. So it was, and this piece itself is kind of about this idea of labor and I guess autonomous machines. But yeah, the algorithm itself is these, what I call swarming entrainment algorithms, or kind of swarming synchronization algorithms.
Was this piece directly inspired by Bernard Russell's essay?
Yeah, yeah. So he wrote, Bernard Russell wrote an essay called "In Praise of Idleness," and which is a really cool essay, and he kind of calls into question a lot of these kind of American ideals of work, and like work as being inherently virtuous. This piece is using kind of this imagery, this tool associated with work, and it was kind of a nice way to connect that idea of the labor as a clock, but also as a tool, and the motion itself to this idea of like work being performed by a machine, but also somewhat by a human, because I'm the programmer. So there's also this kind of weird interplay between who's doing the work. Is it the machine, or is it someone that's actually labored to make this piece happen?
Very interesting, and it has those little rests. And to me, it associates me, if I remember the essay, he used to talk about. Oh, great! We can listen to Menagerie a little bit also. He talked about leisure, and the balance between labor and leisure. So somehow it encompasses that too.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, and I'm not like against the idea of work or anything. I think it is very important, and it's good to work hard, but it is a very, I think, American thing to, they always say Americans want jobs, and then the French want free time. And that's like the difference. Sorry, I've been living in France for the past year, and so it's very evident. There's a very big difference between the notion of work.
We can move on to self-portrait. The piece also inspired by questions of labor and identities. What message did you want to tell us now without us asking your question? What is behind this piece? But how would you describe this piece?
There's actually no sound in. So I guess I should say this was part of a solo show I did in Oakland in 2017 called Invisible Choirs. So it was in a room with other pieces. So there was the sound of the other pieces going on too. But this was at a time when there was a lot of, when I myself was getting into using neural networks, machine learning, and in different artistic productions I could use them. And so one of the aspects of a certain type of neural net at the time, which was called a variational autoencoder, was that it was kind of doing these kind of like image averaging. It was kind of creating these blurry images as outputs. And so people thought of that as kind of a flaw in the network, because they really wanted to make generative, well, it depends on what you're doing, but a lot of people wanted to make generative faces that looked really realistic. And so this was considered kind of like a, I don't know, like a flaw in the network. And so I thought it was an interesting thing to use, that there's, I thought the images themselves were kind of beautiful and ghostly, and kind of captured this kind of like erasure in a way of the image itself. And just the idea of taking like a facial average was kind of interesting. But so I had trained a network on a bunch of Chinese engineering students, and I myself I'm half Chinese. And so then I generated these portraits, and then I used live video to cast my own face on the image. So I guess in some way, as far as, I mean, I don't want to, I guess I don't want to focus too much on the identity aspects of it, but I did write that in the subtext. But it is as a, I guess, as a mixed race person, it was some way of like casting myself into the technology itself. There is the idea that like people of Asian descent are being are kind of erased in some way in cultural media. And at the time, that was kind of more, I don't know, maybe talked about or more. Actually, I guess there's renewed interest in that right now. But it was kind of a way of creating a cyborg, inserting myself into this work. Yes, talking about my kind of racial identity to a certain extent. And also it was kind of just I was drawn to the notion of creating, you know, like an imaginary portrait, imaginary self-portrait. So
We enjoyed this presentation, and thank you for introducing us to your works. And now I'll ask you, Ray.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I mean, I feel like we are just starting. You know, we had a few moments on questions, but I mean, it's quite incredible. I mean, I do have questions about rotary motion and its presence in your work. So such a underlying presence. It's just really beautiful. You know, we look at the body of work. I mean, you're a young person, so, and still I mean, already you have a quite a large repertoire, should we say, of works, and really interesting to see this underlying currents for me, the rotary movement, and redefining how it manifests in the physical space is pretty fascinating. Next month, we are hoping to, so thank you so much for joining us today. We are hoping to continue next month with Jaime Oliver, a Peruvian artist who will be joining us from New York. Please stay safe, stay in touch, and thank you so much. Clap, clap, clap for Nolan. Enjoy your afternoon, and hope to see you again.